All right, welcome to the fourth training of the Electric Truck Bootcamp. I hope everyone had a great long weekend. We're happy you're back with us or with us for the first time. If you're not familiar with the Electric Truck Bootcamp, this is our 10-part educational series on electric truck deployments as part of the lead up to Run on Less Electric, a technology demonstration of battery electric trucks hauling real freight in the real world today, which will be taking place this fall. If you could go to the next slide, just a quick reminder that we've got 13 fleets participating in the run this year. You can see them on the map here, and our team at NACFE and RMI are hard at work visiting each of these participants over the next couple months, putting together some profiles which will be added to the runonless.com website here around mid-August. So keep an eye out for those. In the meantime, feel free to visit Run on Less for more information on the boot camp or on these participants and where they'll be operating these vehicles. We will be kicking off Run on Less Electric, the 3-week demonstration event at ACT Expo this fall. Great. You can see here we've got a discount code for bootcamp attendees. If you'd like to register for ACT Expo, you can save $50 with the code. You can also see the link here. And if we go to the next slide, just a reminder of the 10 bootcamp topics. We've now covered 2 sessions on charging, as well as an initial intro on electric trucks and what's driving their adoption. Today we're talking utilities, and up next we'll be talking incentives 2 weeks from today, looking at everything from building on the utility incentives we're going to hear about today, as well as some of the charging pieces that we've already talked about, hearing what countries like the US and Canada in particular are doing to incentivize truck electrification, as well as some states and even localities. So we hope you'll join us for the remaining trainings in the boot camp. But again, today we're talking utilities, and if you can go to the next slide, I want to thank our sponsor for today's training, NRECA, the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association. Thank you for sponsoring Run on Less Electric, as well as today's boot camp training. Their sponsorship makes it possible for us to offer these trainings to the industry at large, free of cost. We really appreciate the support for the boot camp and Run on Less. And we'll be hearing from staff from NRECA later today. Next slide. Before we jump into today's topic, I'm going to go over a few quick housekeeping items. If you're joined us for the first 3, you're probably used to hearing this, but just as an FYI, you can submit questions in the chat box in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. And rather than scribbling down all the notes or screenshotting all the slides, I do want to note that a recording of today's webinar will be available on the ACT News website as well as on Run on Less, and you'll be emailed a link to download the slides by early next week. So the slides will be available as well. There will be a quick survey at the end. We appreciate you taking 30 seconds to fill that out and let us know how we can make the remaining trainings as helpful for you as possible. And lastly, if you do experience any technical issues, we've got some contact info on the screen that you can reach out to resolve those. Without further ado, let's go to the next slide. We're going to kick it off with a conversation on utilities. So we get a ton of questions around, what do I need to know about utilities? How should I be working with mine? What if I have multiple utilities for my operations across the continent, etc.? And we're going to try to answer as many of these questions as possible today. And the first thing I'll note with utilities is that it is important for fleets and utilities to get to know one another. These are 2 groups, 2 industries really, electric utilities and trucking fleets, who historically haven't worked together too much beyond, fleets paying their monthly bill for their facilities. It hasn't typically been something that's been front of mind in terms of how do utilities operate, how are they regulated, what do I need to know about my rates, etc. And so to borrow an analogy that NACFE's Industry Engagement Director, Dave Schaller, uses often, we think about where utilities and fleets are today as almost like middle schoolers at a dance, where you've got one group, let's say boys on one side of the gym, girls on the other, And they know they want to talk to each other, and they know they want to get dancing eventually, but they're not quite sure how to do it. They seem to be speaking different languages almost in sometimes. And so what we at NACFE and RMI are trying to facilitate are bringing those groups to the center of that gymnasium, having those conversations, and starting to learn a little bit more about how each other thinks so that we can all dance together, party together, in this case, deploy electric trucks successfully together. And so to that end, I do want to call out that NACFE and RMI have created a couple different primers. One for trucking fleets interested in learning what they need to know about utilities at a very high level, and the other, the reverse, for utilities interested in learning what do I need to know about the trucking industry in order to support electrification. And these are both quick 2-pagers. They're available on nacfe.org, free to download. So I encourage anyone on the call who, if you're thinking, that's me, I would love just a quick primer on what I need to know, I would encourage you to go download these. I will say though, that again, to borrow from Dave Schaller, they say if you've met one fleet, you've met one fleet. The same is true for utilities. If you've met one electric utility, you've met one electric utility. They each tend to operate a bit differently. And so I would say it's important, whether you're a fleet trying to get to know your particular utility, to reach out to them, or vice versa. If you're a utility looking to get to know the fleets operating in your territory, we encourage utilities to interact, perhaps join your state trucking association as a great way to really understand what's happening in your region. With that, I will say utilities have a crucial role to play in supporting truck electrification. That's why we're going to spend the next hour talking about them. I think most folks know utilities are responsible for generating and distributing electrons. That's certainly their prime role and what we all think of. But you can see on your screen here 4 buckets of ways that utilities can and should be supporting truck electrification in particular, beyond just delivering those electrons. And so that includes everything from assisting with fleet planning and site assessments, particularly for fleets who may have more than one depot. If you're trying to prioritize, they can help you understand what the infrastructure is at each current site. They may also help with interconnection and capacity upgrades, things called make ready, we're going to talk more about today. But these make ready upgrades to the electric grid may sometimes be cost prohibitive for customers. And so in some places, you'll even see utilities offering make-ready programs where there is funding available to help support these infrastructure upgrades. Definitely a key bucket to pay attention to. Some utilities may also incentivize customer-side charger costs. We see this in particular for fleets with operations in disadvantaged communities. There may be funding to help even with that customer side, so not the utility's responsibility, but what the fleet would typically be responsible for in terms of purchasing and installing the EVSE or the charger. Sometimes there might be funding available through your utility for that. And then finally, this last bucket that it can be overlooked actually, rate design is critical. And this is one of the most important roles, I'll say, for utilities in terms of supporting truck electrification, and more specifically, ensuring that it is a cost-effective transition compared to diesel. And so this is where you'll see things like time of use rates, demand charges, subscription charges, a lot of these topics that we'll touch on today. All of these things will impact a fleet's strategy for managed charging, a lot of those topics that we covered on the 2nd and 3rd bootcamp trainings. So with that, we can go to the next slide. We are going to hear from 4 experts in the utility field today. We'll hear from Brian Sloboda, the Director of Consumer Solutions at NRECA. Then we will hear from Andrew Papson, e-mobility advisor at Southern California Edison, and learn what they're up to in Southern California. And then we're going to move over to the East Coast and hear from Ryan Wheeler, the fleet electrification product owner at National Grid. And finally, we're going to hear from David Bisnow, the Executive Vice President, Strategy and Operations of MP2 Energy, a retail energy provider, to tell us what are retail energy providers and why you might consider working with one. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Brian for an introduction on how utilities are thinking about truck electrification. Brian, take it away.
Hey, thank you very much, Jesse. So happy to be here today and so happy to be sponsoring the Run on Less demonstration and this webinar. So next slide, please. So NRECA is the trade association for America's electric cooperatives. Those are 800 utilities around the country. Our utilities are a little bit different. We're owned by the consumers we serve, tend to be in rural areas, and also tend to be smaller. But co-ops are very excited about this potential because of the economic opportunity that it provides our local communities, with electric trucks having lower operating and maintenance costs. Next slide, please. But co-ops are just one type of utility. And really what I want to talk about are utilities at a higher level before we get on to the rest of the panelists who are going to have very specific programs that they're dealing with. So when you look at America's utilities, there's really four types out there. Cooperatives are one type, and what's different with cooperatives is that they are consumer owned, and they're typically not regulated by the state. They're typically regulated by the customers. So if you're a fleet operator and you're served by a co-op, you're actually an owner of that cooperative. You get the excess profits back from that cooperative, and you get to vote for the board of directors and the strategic direction of your electric utility. And then there are municipal utilities, about 2,000 of them nationwide. They're owned by city government. They function as a part of government. And they tend to be in some of the smaller cities of the United States, but certainly some large areas like Los Angeles is a municipal. But typically, many of you are going to be served by investor-owned utilities, 168 IOUs, as we call them, around the country. They typically are regulated by the state, so that will often impact the types of programs that they're able to offer you. And that's really, as Jesse mentioned, some of you may be served by multiple utilities if you are in different states, different areas of the same state. And you may get frustrated about why you have to fill forms out more than once, why one utility offers one program versus another. Part of it has to do with that regulatory structure. There are folks called interveners. They participate in those regulatory hearings, and they have an agenda that they bring with them, and that would impact what a utility is able to offer. Other utilities are smaller, such as a not-for-profit electric cooperative. So you might not see some of the programs out there. And one term you may hear are demand charge holidays. So you typically won't see that at a co-op. And then there's a fourth type of entity out there called retail energy providers, and there's one of them on the panel today, and they provide utility services to customers. And really what you end up having is this, what we call this tapestry of utility service territories, and they're not all contiguous. Many times co-op service territory is what we call Swiss cheese, where the rural areas are served by the co-op, and the cities and towns are served by either municipals or investor-owned utilities where there's greater density of customers. So it does get a little confusing. But what I want to say is that electricity is going to be very different than diesel. Electricity is produced on demand. You can't easily store it. Storage technologies are getting better, but it's still, when you flip that light switch on or you plug that truck into a charger, that electricity is being made instantaneously at a power plant. But also, America's power plants are getting cleaner, they're getting greener, and that's going to help your electric trucks. It's going to help you meet sustainability goals. Next slide, please. Really to echo what Jesse said, the goal here is partnerships. NRECA, which is the trade association for the co-ops, Edison Electric Institute, which is the trade association for the investor-owns, and American Public Power Association, which is the trade association for the municipals, created this document, Preparing to Plug in Your Fleet, 10 Things to Consider. If you Google it, you'll find it on one of our websites. It's all the same document. And the goal of this document is to help you start that conversation. And that's really what we want to see happen, are the fleet operators and the utilities begin to talk, because we have to understand each other's business. Utilities, honestly, we don't really understand fleets, and we're learning. And fleet operators they're used to the way that diesel and traditional fuels operate, not electricity. So, for example, the utility is going to want to know the usage patterns. When do you plan on plugging that truck in? Because when you plug the truck in, can significantly impact the cost that you're paying. There's this thing called peak, and I think you've heard about it on some of the previous NACFE webinars. Utilities typically charge more during peak, and we don't want you to use the product during peak. It's not about increasing revenue, it's not about increasing profits, it's not about increasing margin. It's really a reflection of the cost to serve the particular load. Having something charged in the middle of the night, much, much cheaper when you look at most utility rate plans. This document will help you answer the key questions that your utility wants to know. What's your future fleet expansion? How big of a charger are you installing? The utility wants to really make sure that you're installing the right size charger. I know it's kind of hard to believe. There's going to be some consultants out there that try to upsell you and sell you something bigger that you may not need and may actually cost you more upfront and more over the long haul. The utility is not trying to sell you something. You're already a customer of the utility. You're either an owner of the utility or the utility is regulated. They're not trying to sell you more stuff. They want to make sure that you're optimizing your purchases in the way to help your business meet its goals. So this form is an excellent place to do it. So what I would do is encourage you, download that document from one of the websites and then call the utility. If you don't know who your utility is, someone's going to know. Usually if you have a energy manager at your company, they work with the utility. The fleet manager and the energy manager should have that conversation with the local utility and start talking about goals, start talking about what you want to achieve and what your time frame is. And as Jesse mentioned, that make ready can sometimes get expensive. We're looking very closely at some legislation in Congress. There's going to be grants out there. And your utility may be able to help you pursue some of those grants to lower the costs of the chargers, to lower the costs of the trucks possibly, and maybe even lower the cost of that make ready, which are the wires that help to serve that load. But the most important thing that I want you to take away from this is a partnership. We're in this together, and it's really very, very exciting to have this brand new technology that help us both out. So Jesse, that's all I have today.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Brian. Great introduction to utilities and how they're supporting truck electrification. I think you hit the nail on the head. This is about partnerships, and if you want to be successful, we can't encourage you enough to work with your utility or utilities, as it may be, as early as possible in the process. So up next, we're going to dive deep into how a couple utilities are really supporting truck electrification on the ground. And up first, we've got Andrew Papson from SCE. Andrew, over to you.
Hey everybody, how are you doing today? I'm with Southern California Edison, where I lead business development for Charge Ready Transport, which is our program for helping our customers deploy EV trucks and buses. Part of my job is to share knowledge and lessons learned with fleet operators on how to go electric. And for this presentation, I'll be speaking directly to the fleet operators on the line with 3 topics you should know when working with your utility. Next slide, please. First, I want to throw up a map. Southern California Edison covers 50,000 square miles in the state, cover the greater Los Angeles Basin, Inland Empire, and parts of the Central Valley. I think relevant to the folks on this call, our territory covers fleets that move goods from the Port of Long Beach east to the Inland Empire distribution centers in Ontario and Riverside, and then distributed from there. We have extraordinary goods movement in our territory and extraordinary opportunities for fleets looking to go electric. Next slide, please. The first topic I want to cover is just walking through with you the components of EV charging infrastructure. As fleet operators, it's really important for you to know how all the pieces fit together. In this diagram, you see conceptual layout of a property, starting with the power pole in the top left. The power pole brings grid power to the local transformer that then feeds power to your property. On property, you have switchgear that distributes the power along several circuits, with each circuit serving an individual charger. Depending on the layout of your site, you could be running power, hundreds of feet from the power pole to the transformer, or the transformer to the switchgear, and then running it even further on individual circuits to chargers, all of which underground. That adds a lot to the complexity. Next slide, please. Thinking about it more complexity, there are two halves to any project. There's what the utility will call to the meter, which is all the work off-site that's shown in green here, the power pole, the transformer, the meter, and then behind the meter, which is all the electrical equipment you have on your site. A standard project, if you talk to most utilities, the customer is in charge of building everything behind the meter. On your property, you hire an electrical contractor. Before the meter, the utility builds out the portion in green, often with significant cost sharing with the customer. Although there are various other models out there. Southern California Edison's Charge Ready Transport program, we're helping our EV fleets by building out the infrastructure they need on both sides, going all the way from the power pole to the stub up for the charging equipment with our contractors and at our cost. So I encourage you to talk to your local utility, see if they have similar programs. Next slide. Next topic, I want to touch on electricity rates. I know in prior boot camps, you've talked about demand charges and time of use pricing. I don't want to go back and repeat what you heard in the past, but I do want to share some insights on why utilities have these rate structures. Electrical grid isn't like water or natural gas, where you have reservoirs you can store product. We need to produce or procure enough electricity to match your usage minute by minute. And as electricity use grows during peak time, we have to procure more expensive power from plants. This means that wholesale electricity rises rapidly rates during peak times. On the local side, we need to build out local infrastructure, which means substations, circuits, and transformers to handle the maximum power load that our customers will consume. If the systems are designed with too many high power spikes from EV trucks and buses charging at once, we're going to have to build out beefier infrastructure to accommodate. So in short, poorly managed EV charging power is more expensive to both produce and deliver. That's the purpose of things like peak pricing and demand charges, a way to share that added cost. They align everybody's incentives, so we all win when power is efficiently used. And they make sure that everyone's paying their fair price on the system. So I hope that context gives you some insight into why utilities have these rate structures. That being said, there are a few things that you can do to reduce your electricity bills. We always encourage our customers to right-size their EV charging design, which means choosing the number of chargers and the power level you need to complete your operations, but don't overbuild if you don't need it. For example, if you're running a truck 2 shifts return to base, so maybe you have 6 hours overnight to charge, you don't need a lightning charger that charges your truck in 30 minutes. You can get a more moderately speed charger, charges it in 4 hours, which allows you to complete your operations. You're going to save money both upfront in capital and ongoing in your rates. Try to reduce your charging during the most expensive peak times. For us, that's 4 p.m. to 9 p.m. in the summer. It doesn't mean shut things off completely, but where possible, shift things later in the day or slow down your chargers. And similarly, avoid infrequent power spikes that can drive demand. Last, consider capital dollars on distributed resources like solar, batteries, or vehicle to grid, but only if it makes sense. First see how much money you can save through the management, and then see what payback you can get through additional spending on capital. Next slide, please. Last thing I want to touch on is the thought process as you develop your fleet plan and engage in utility. This is really for fleet managers on the line who are just starting to think through how they would approach EV trucks and buses. The first step for you is to think through your EV fleet plans. You look at your existing fleet and you think the number and type of EV trucks or buses you're interested to deploy, on what schedule, and how will you use them. For example, hours a day and number of miles a day. You guys are the experts in your own fleet. You know your own fleet procurement plans and can drive your best EV deployments. Second step is to convert your EV fleet plan into a charging plan, so you can actually boil down to the number and type of chargers you'll need to meet your operational needs. This includes your charging strategy, whether it's overnight or midday, the power level, and how you'll phase in charging as your vehicles phase in as well. Some fleet utilities may be able to help here. Charge Ready Transport, we have advisory services to walk our fleets through these considerations, but those may not be available at all utilities. The last step is to work with your utility to design and build the infrastructure. Your utility is going to come at you with new terminology that you haven't been using. I want to put some of these up here. Utility is going to ask you about connected load, basically the number and power level of chargers you're installing, forecasted demand, your amount of charging you'll be using growing over the next 5 to 10 years, your site plan, which is an engineering drawing of where you'll place the chargers, and a single line diagram, which is a conceptual design of how all the electrical components will connect together. One thing I want to touch on, you guys do have a variety of resources available. If you're a fleet operator and you're going to be in EV trucks or buses for the long haul, I strongly recommend you begin building out institutional knowledge on EVs. This could mean dedicated energy management department, could mean building EV expertise in your fleet management. You can also rely on external consultants or even the vehicle OEMs to help with EV infrastructure. But I strongly encourage you to work with these outside parties to help you develop your plan, not for them to develop a plan for you. Last, be in touch with your utilities, and they can help you through some of the decision-making process shown here. You should reach out to the utility early, find the right contact person for EV fleet deployments, and start building that relationship to explore how the utility can help. Next slide, please. If you found any of this information useful and would like to continue the conversation about EV fleets or deploying EV trucks and buses in Edison territory, please reach out to us. You can shoot us an email at chargereadytransport@sce.com. Also encourage you to visit our website, sce.com/CRT, for program information, case studies, EV best practices, and more. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew. It's great to hear how leaders like SCE are supporting trucking electrification. And I'll also note, if you harken back to that Run on Less Electric map up at the top, quite a few of the participants for Run on Less Electric this year are in SCE's territory. That's certainly a testament to the support that SCE is providing. So thank you for that. As I mentioned, we're now going to transfer coasts and hear what's going on outside California, in this case in the Northeast with National Grid. And I'm going to turn it over to Ryan Wheeler to tell us what they are up to and how they're supporting truck electrification.
Thanks, Jesse. As you mentioned, I'm Ryan Wheeler. I'm coming from National Grid up in the Northeast. So I'm located in Albany, New York, and I'm our fleet electrification product owner for our EV programs across New York, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island for National Grid. So similar to Andrew and Brian, I'm going to be focused, to our audience of fleet operators about how best to engage with us at the utility. I think it's already been loud and clear that as early and as often as possible, you can work with us to make sure that you get information in your hands to be able to make the best decisions. Next slide, please. I want to just start real quick with National Grid's vision. We at National Grid are very committed to clean transportation overall, with three main guiding principles around reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but also providing equitable and affordable access to clean transportation of all types. So not just a passenger vehicle perspective, but really making sure that all the goods and the services and everything moving around in an economy can help customers of all types get access to clean transportation. And then third goal is to make sure that we integrate those vehicles as smartly as possible to limit the impact on the grid, but also to share those savings with customers as much as we can. Next slide, please. So why fleets? I always like to make sure that we level set a little bit here, because in the current landscape, passenger vehicles tend to get a lot of the airtime, and so I always love to mention these couple stats to talk about why fleets, and in particular the medium and heavy duty vehicles. So when you think about the 15 states that have signed on to the ZEV MOU goal, It's a very aggressive target in the next 9 years to be able to get 30% of new sales by 2030. But this is actually a really efficient way to reduce both CO2 and air emissions. So medium and heavy duty vehicles can get up to 30 times the amount of CO2 savings per vehicle. And then from a public health perspective, medium and heavy duty vehicles can have more than 100 times the particulate matter emissions per vehicle. And so if you can take those vehicles off the road, from a public standpoint, this turns into not only a clean transportation and a lower cost alternative, but it can provide substantial public health benefits as well. The American Lung Association identified that for New York and Massachusetts, we can find more than $5 billion per year in annual health savings by the year 2050. So this is not just an on-road problem. This can really help accelerate public health benefits of clean transportation as well. And then I've already mentioned the equity piece, but National Grid in particular in our 3 states, we really want to focus on the helping communities of all types, specifically those in disadvantaged communities like LMI and EJC communities. And then just one quick stat to highlight on the fleet assessments. I know Andrew mentioned fleet assessments. We just launched our fleet assessment services in Massachusetts. We've identified more than $40 million in total cost of ownership savings for those vehicles. So we're already, the commentary is always that these vehicles are going to be coming in the future, but we've already identified more than 35% of the vehicles that we've assessed could be electrified today. So already some substantial opportunities to electrify those vehicles. Next slide, please. I want to highlight a few of the challenges that customers face here in the fleet electrification space. So when you think about the fleet operators with the magnitude of the challenges that you're facing, the vehicle is changing, the infrastructure is changing, the price of the fuel is changing. This leads to a lot of question marks, and we at the utility are here to help for many of those questions that come up. So things like, how much does a charger cost? How do I actually fuel these vehicles? What does it mean from an infrastructure standpoint, from a safety perspective? How much charging can I put in my site, et cetera? So all those questions can come to the utility early on in the process, so that you can have a better understanding of how to navigate this transition from just starting to think about it all the way through the operations of your fleet. And so this can lead to substantial benefits for both the fleet operator as well as all of the customers that are on the electrical grid. So everybody can get equitable access to clean transportation. Obviously, in the last 15 months or so, everybody's been getting a lot of packages delivered. So every package that gets delivered or grocery items that are delivered to those distribution centers, that clean transportation benefit impacts all of the customers that are consuming both the goods that are delivered as well as the electricity. This leads to lower upfront cost for fleet operators like yourself, where the utilities can provide infrastructure and EV charger rebates. We can provide fleet advisory services to help think through the transition to electric vehicles. And then, once that vehicle is purchased, support around, making sure that you're utilizing the chargers that you purchased, what other additional funding opportunities are out there, and then how can you optimize your bill as you continue to use those vehicles. Next slide, please. So a bit of a word chart here, but wanted to show the full customer journey and how utilities can help you through that journey. When you think about the left side of this chart, just starting to ask questions, it's really important to find that right person in the utility that can help answer your questions. So many utilities across the country are really starting to identify the single points of contact structure. Andrew certainly mentioned it. We at National Grid have this structure in place, but helping those fleet customers have one person that can help them through that entire journey that you see on this page. So that's crucial to reach out early and to make sure that you understand who to go to when you have questions in this space. So then you can start thinking about planning your EV conversion in terms of how it's going to affect your bill, your site, as well as the overall operations of your fleet. And then start thinking about the infrastructure. This is where every utility is going to have slightly different programs in place, but both on the utility side and on the customer side, there are a lot of different options to help get the infrastructure installed. And then on the vehicle side and on the charger side, state, federal, and utility rebates are all available for those. And utilities can also help you through the process in terms of managing your charging, understanding the cost that you're going to incur throughout the life of the vehicle, and helping think through a lot of the other kind of softer costs that come with electrifying your fleet. Next slide, please. So a few different case studies. I know that we're talking about trucks here, but National Grid has a few different bus examples that are helping us kind of get smarter in this space in terms of understanding how these vehicles are going to impact the grid. So in Massachusetts, we have a vehicle to grid pilot project where we've had electric school buses that are participating in testing vehicle to grid capabilities, where those buses can provide energy back to the grid. In New York, our transit authorities for public transit buses are aggressively pursuing electric buses. So 25% of their fleet in the next few years, and 100% of their fleet a few years beyond that. So very aggressive projects are going on in that space. And then I've already touched on the fleet assessments, but in our territory, we're working with more than 100 fleets over the next couple of years to help pull forward that conversion process and to get the education and the right information in those customers' hands, so they can start asking the questions as quickly as possible. And then next slide, I'll cover one last slide to talk through our key lessons learned. So, up in the Northeast, we're a tad behind some of the deployments in California, but we still have pretty similar lessons learned. And I think from an awareness and consideration perspective, we've talked a lot about the questions that everybody on the phone has, but the area where your utility can help the most is around these site feasibility assessments. Too often customers think that the utility is the last step in the process. Utilities need to be contacted as soon as possible to be able to make sure you have the infrastructure in place at your site or your sites to help you choose where the vehicles can go and when. And on the vehicle procurement side, oftentimes you're dealing with a dealer or with another vendor. Contacting a utility, I have it as number 3 here, but it actually could be number 1, that as soon as you are thinking about electrifying some vehicles, contact your utility to be able to start the process with them, because the lead time on those infrastructure projects can be substantial. And then on the operations planning, thinking through the charging optimization, scheduling, and rate structures, that's crucial as well. We've had many conversations with all of the fleets in our territory to help think through those bill impact conversations. And I'll quickly turn to the last slide, but just as a thank you, and similar to Andrew, reach out to us with any questions, and would definitely encourage you to contact your own utility to get similar information from them as well. Thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you so much, Ryan. It's great to hear what National Grid is up to in all of these ways that you're working with medium and heavy duty vehicle fleets. Last but not least, we are going to hear from David from MP2 Energy about retail energy providers and why fleets might consider working with one. David, over to you.
Thank you, Jesse. Hopefully everyone's having a great afternoon and had a great Memorial Day holiday. You can flip to the next slide. My name is David Disno. I am the Executive Vice President of Strategy and Operations with MP2. We are a Shell wholly owned subsidiary, so Shell Energy owns our company. I'm going to explain for a few minutes today the role that a retail electric provider can play in the future electrification of your fleet or the current needs that you might have. Briefly on MP2, we do a number of things. We are what we call, what is called in industry sort of a full service retail electric provider. We are national. We operate in nearly every deregulated energy market in the United States, and we offer a full suite of products, anything from helping you with your actual electricity rate and various product structures on how you can purchase your electricity, but also we can help you meet your renewable energy goals and needs. And we can even figure out ways that you potentially can monetize or make money from your fleet or the assets that you build. And a lot of folks are very interested in that. If you could flip to the next slide. Briefly on electricity regulation, it is not in every state in the U.S. It is in the graph on the left kind of gives you an idea of which states are have what we call choice and how you choose your provider. And the way that we operate in comparison to a utility, I'll explain in a second. But often it is we partner with utilities, and in some we have a friendly competition with our utility counterparts. But in both instances, we want to work together to make sure, as the previous folks have said, to meet your needs, not only your current needs but your future and growing needs. If we can move to the next slide. Just giving an idea of kind of how things are set up right now. On this slide, if you look to the lower right, the red shaded areas, transmission, distribution, that's the delivery of the electricity and that's the maintenance of the grid. That is still regulated in every state in the United States. So that does not change. Utilities do a great job at that. They maintain the grid, they maintain the poles and wires, they read your meter. In the event of an outage, you still contact them. And the great thing is, regardless of whether you, partner with a retail electric provider like MP2, or if you go somewhere else, the reliability of your electricity is unchanged. It's the same poles and wires and the same folks you've been dealing with that you have been historically. What we can do on the retail electric provider side is we can offer you a number of different products and solutions, ways to buy your electricity, ways to meet your green sustainability needs. We can also help you potentially even monetize your assets that I mentioned earlier, and I'll talk about here in a second. And one of the kind of unique and cool things as well is we've had a few folks earlier talk about single point of contact. We can as well offer a single point of contact, and that is one of the things that we do, but we can offer it geographically in many different states. So as opposed to just having a single point of contact in one geographic territory, we potentially can offer a single point of contact, across 13 different states in the country. So where your fleet may operate currently, or potentially where you may grow into, in the next 1, 3, 4, 5 years, we can help you consolidate your vendors, find solutions, and help you kind of wade through some of the challenges of doing business in different states. Has been mentioned earlier, the regulation and the rules from state to state often differ, and so we can help you with that. If we can go to the next slide. Finally, what we do really as a retail electric provider is we focus on you, the customer, and we try to help you find solutions that meet your current needs as well as your future needs. The unique thing is that, we have over 1,000 participants listening on the call today. It's likely that from the various companies that we have that you guys all have individual needs. You may need, electricity at different times of the day in different amounts. And, one thing I learned when I first got into this industry 20 years ago is that electricity is the only, or it used to be, it's changing slightly, non-storable commodity in the world in large quantities. So for instance, we can store electricity, in a battery in our phone or even in other batteries, but we can't store it in large quantities, save it up, and then disperse it over days, weeks, months, or years. For the most part, the storage that we have currently is in batteries, and we can discharge a little bit of storage to meet immediate needs. But this is also a reason that price fluctuations are real, that, often the changes in price that you may see on your electricity bill from month to month, you may not be able to understand. Supply and demand need to be balanced together to make sure that we have reliable electricity, but then also, like any commodity, the less supply or more demand there is, prices often rise, and then the inverse is true when supply is rich and demand is low. What we can do as a retail provider is we can work with you to help you guys meet your needs. We can offer you fixed price products, meaning you can lock in a price of power for a short period of time, say 6 months, a month even, or maybe a year. But also in long term, we can do deals in many instances across the U.S. that can give you a fixed price for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And so you can have budget certainty as you're planning your growth and your needs. You'll know exactly what your costs are per kilowatt hour or per megawatt hour. And then all you have to do then, and we can help you with this as well, is figure out how much electricity you're going to use, what your quantity will be, and you can have a really good forward view into what your costs might be for budgeting purposes, as well as for your potential growth of your business. One of the things we also do is we can offer fully customizable products, meaning there are literally infinite ways almost that you can buy your electricity. Depending on when you use it, how much you're going to use, and it may change from today, what it's in comparison to what it might look like tomorrow, or at some point, 5 or 10 years down the road. We can help you structure to make sure that you're getting the either lowest cost you want, or if you have other needs, maybe you want to meet some green, renewable, or sustainability needs. We can help you understand the minutia from sort of region to region and ensure that you meet your individual needs. Once again, to fulfill what you are doing currently and potentially what you may do going forward. Last but not least, and one of the things that we do that is widely accepted by our customers and has become more popular is we can help you monetize your assets. In many instances, if you own charging stations or if you have a fleet of electric trucks, the electricity potentially at the station that it pulls and or the electricity in those vehicles and the batteries, those are assets. We potentially can help you monetize those. We can help you sell power back to the grid when electricity is expensive. We can help you curb your demand when electricity is expensive, or we can help you buy more power when electricity is less expensive. We work with you. We focus on often deep analytics and increasing technology to make sure that as you continue to grow, the way that you purchase your electricity is determined by you and potentially not, something off the shelf. So we can be very customized in our approach. That's pretty much it. There would be much more to go over if we had more time, but I do appreciate everyone's time today, and I look forward to the Q&A session. Thanks, Jesse.
Thank you, David. Thank you to all of our panelists. I will invite you all to turn your cameras back on, as we've got almost 15 minutes now for some Q&A. We've got some great questions submitted from attendees, both in advance and live. And I'm just going to jump in and start taking us through some of these questions. The first one, which I've seen a few different versions of, really has to do with how quickly utilities are expecting this additional load from, in this case, trucking fleets to come onto the grid, and how you're thinking about meeting that, on what sort of timeline, et cetera. And there were a couple questions specifically asking about how they plan to do this in the Midwest or in rural areas. So Brian, maybe I'll turn it over to you first to take a stab at how are rural cooperatives in particular thinking about meeting this new demand?
Sure. Yeah, bring it on. They're ready. I think there's a lot of planning going on, and I love Ryan's presentation, how detailed their process is at National Grid, and what I would say is that's every utility, very detailed, very thoughtful about how they're approaching the future. But I would say in rural areas, you're going to have some challenges, especially if you're relying on public charging. So look at the truck stops that are out there. So if we go 5, 6, 7 years down the road, when we have 500, 600-mile ranges on those Class 8 trucks, and you're doing over-the-road trucking, so you're going from Andrew's territory through the co-op territories over to Ryan's territory up in New England, and you're stopping at those truck stops, that's going to be a lot of that make ready that's going to have to happen. So those conversations with those travel center owners, whether it's Flying J or Pilot or whoever it is, those conversations also need to happen. So it's not just the fleet owners, it's also the fueling center owners. And coming up with some really cool technological solutions. I've worked in utilities for 20-something years now, because I'm getting really old. And one of the criticisms I've always heard is, oh, electric utilities are so boring. No, they're not boring. You're talking about people that are on the cutting edge of technological innovation. So, looking at solar panels at your site, looking at batteries at your site to help defer make-ready costs, to help you be greener, all with planning with the utility in mind. So the utility can walk you through all of those options, but certainly it's like everything else. If you're in a rural area, you know what I'm talking about. I grew up in a rural area. Life in rural area ain't that easy. Okay, so you're accustomed to doing more. You're accustomed to doing more work, and it's going to be the same thing with electrifying the fleets. But such a huge upside for everyone involved with economic development and lower emissions. So it's a great challenge to have.
Great, thank you, Brian. And I agree. I think we've heard some great examples today of how utilities are really at the forefront of innovation. Anyone else want to add to that? Andrew, do you want to share maybe how SE is thinking about this additional load and planning for it?
Sure, absolutely. We have a 5-year planning process that we iterate on. And one of the things we're really diving into right now is understanding the growth of EV trucks throughout our region and their uptake at the specific local level, the specific circuit level, the specific zip code level, and how we can start planning for that load today.
Excellent, thanks.
Yeah, and Jesse, I would just chime in as well that one of the things that we are looking to fleet operators to help with actually is around kind of these clustered loads. So if you look at any map, similar to what Brian and Andrew already mentioned, that if you find a distribution center for one company, it's very, very likely that you're going to find a distribution center for another company just down the road. And as part of this 5-year planning process, we're trying to get a lot more granularity on when and where those vehicles are going to electrify. And so, creating some of that transparency between customers is going to be really crucial to help minimize the total cost to upgrade the grid. You know, because one customer doing a megawatt of power is one thing, but then 10 customers doing 10 megawatts within a square mile is a totally different thing. So, you know, having that conversation across customers is also crucial.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ryan. So as fleets are making their master plans for electrification, utilities are doing the same thing at their territory scale. Just moving on here to our next question. I've got one really about these different types of tariffs or rates that fleets are seeing from their utilities. And the question is kind of what % of customers, or how common is it for utilities to have, you know, time of use rates, demand charges, subscription charges, any trends that we're noting in terms of some of these options being more or less popular over time? David, do you want to try to tackle that one?
Sure. Yeah, given that we operate in multiple states over multiple utilities, we certainly see this. I think everyone on the panel probably knows this, and for folks in the audience, time of use rates are designed in part because electricity is not storable, as I'd mentioned earlier, at least in large quantities. And so it's an incentive to potentially use electricity when everyone else is not using electricity, to make sure that we have a reliable supply and the grid can stay balanced. As we've seen technology increase recently, especially in the area of storage, we've seen these time of use rates sort of adapt and adjust to it. As a retailer, one of the unique things we can do is we can provide custom time of use rates to meet your specific needs. But from a utility standpoint, and operating in many utilities, we expect that we'll continue to see time of use rates going forward. The spread between the cost and the number of hours per day with which you can use, we think may be adjusted and may adapt to technology. One thing I'll say, and then turn it over to anyone else on the panel, is this is an area to get close to your single point of contact at the utilities and/or at your retail electric provider. We can potentially help you guys sift through this. These rates can be seasonal in nature, and they can also be based on the amount of electricity that you use. So there can be many components to them, and it can get a little bit complicated.
Thanks, David. Anyone else want to add to
that? I could make a comment, Jesse.
Sure.
When I work with fleets, I get a lot of questions about, what if demand charges are high? What if peak pricing is high? What I encourage people is don't focus so much on the specific components. The key performance indicator for electricity costs is your annual cost per kilowatt hour. That's like your annual average, fuel cost. And yeah, electricity would be higher during the summer than during the winter, but it all averages out. And so focus on what you can do to manage your annual electricity average cost. Don't dive so deep into the specific components. I think that's the best approach.
Thanks, Andrew. Great advice. So our next question is, again, a few versions of this, but we've heard from some leading utilities, I would say, on the call today about the programs or rates that you have put in place to support this electrification. Certainly not every utility in North America is on par with offering, whether it's the Make Ready programs or rates conducive to fleets. For those on the call who might be in one of these territories where their utility doesn't offer these sorts of programs and rates, any advice in terms of how best to work with their utility or engage them on thinking about perhaps offering these in the future? Maybe Andrew or Ryan, if you want to jump in, even just to hear kind of how your utilities have gotten to this point.
Sure. So Southern California Edison, we've been focusing on electric vehicles for many years through our Charge Ready program, starting with light duty cars, working with state regulations and our regulator. All utilities in California are building programs specifically targeting EV trucks and buses. And the direction we're taking with our program is the Make Ready approach. So for our customers, we're doing the design, we're building with our contractors. All they have to do is purchase the charging stations and install it with their electrical contractor. One of the side benefits we're seeing from this approach is we're learning a whole bunch about the freight industry, about different businesses that are out there, different charging needs, and this is helping us as a utility develop better products and better communication to help our freight customers.
Great, thanks. Ryan, anything to add there?
Yeah, I would just chime in that I think as we've already talked about, the regulatory process can be very different for all these different jurisdictions, and so similar to what Andrew just mentioned, our programs have started with light duty vehicles and have kind of evolved into the medium and heavy duty vehicles. But I would encourage anybody that doesn't have a utility program in place to really push your local electricity provider to kind of skip that first phase. I think there are so many lessons learned across the nation and around the world, in terms of how to put out this make-ready infrastructure. And the vehicles are coming, quickly on the medium and heavy duty side. So, a lot of those learnings can be applied to those medium and heavy duty vehicles. So, just want to chime in that learning step doesn't always have to happen at every single utility, and really try to work with them to help get a lot of these programs in place at scale. Rather than skipping that, rather than doing the pilot phase for a few years and just going straight to getting these solutions at scale.
Absolutely. And David, I know you spoke a bit in your presentation about, why fleets might consider a retail energy provider, particularly if their local utility isn't offering the programs that some of these folks that we've heard from today are. You want to say anything more there?
Well, this is where I'd say it's great to work with the retail provider to do this, because we can potentially customize something for you. The folks in the panel to the right, I think there are many really good programs currently offered. But if there's not one and you're in an area that is deregulated, this is a great reason to engage with a provider. We can potentially customize an approach for you, and we can also potentially work with the utility on your behalf. So I think it once again, it comes back down to that relationship that you have, whether it's with your utility or your provider, to ensure that you're not only meeting your existing needs, but really to meet your forward needs and your needs in the future.
Absolutely. And we're hoping that, through this boot camp series and other educational opportunities, fleets are more and more aware of these types of programs and options that are out there, because the more that utilities and retail energy providers hear about this demand, this desire for this sort of support, the more they'll be willing and able to support it. So I think we've got time for one more question. We've gotten one around, are there some case studies out there, some publications in terms of how fleets have best worked with utilities to date? And I think that there are a few. So I'm going to ask maybe Andrew and Ryan first. Any publications you want to direct folks to who are interested in learning more about case studies?
Sure thing. Thank you, Jesse. Strongly encourage everybody to visit our program website, sce.com/CRT. For those in Southern California, it has program-specific info, but anybody nationwide, it has general education on electrification, best practices. It has a number of case studies of successful fleet deployments in our area, and who you can reach out to learn more. We're always doing webinars and educations, and we always place the recordings of the webinars online so you can hear directly from fleet managers about how they electrified their fleet. Plenty of resources for anybody on our website, sce.com/CRT.
Thank you, Andrew. Ryan, anything to add?
Yeah, very, very, very similar. There I think we, I mentioned our fleet advisory services. We have one of the case studies on our fleet focused website. So National Grid's EV Fleet Hub. Definitely feel free to Google for that. And I know from past experience that a lot of times, when working with utilities, you check your utility's website and discover that the resources may not be there, or you can't quite find it. But as Andrew mentioned, I think going to some of those hotspots where this transition is already happening and looking at the utility websites there can really help you understand how to go through this journey. So don't get frustrated. You may not be able to find the resources right at your fingertips with your own utility.
Thank you. So I see we're right at the top of the hour. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have today, but I want to thank our expert panelists again for sharing their expertise with the Electric Truck Bootcamp audience. I want to thank all of you for being here. If you have additional questions, feel free to send them our way. We'll do our best to get back to everyone. And if we could go to the last slide, just really quickly, a reminder that there is a survey. Please fill it out and let us know what you thought about the webinar today. And for those of you who have been enjoying testing your knowledge of the information presented on these boot camps, just a reminder that the quiz for this training number 4 is now live on runonless.com. If you want to go take the quiz and see if you got all this great information that we heard today. Our next training will be 2 weeks from today on June 15th, where we'll be talking about additional incentives for electrification. And with that, that's all we have for today. Thank you again, and we hope to see you in 2 weeks.